If you woke up in medieval times, the first thing that would hit you isn't the absence of smartphones or skyscrapers or even the smell of manure and open sewage. It's the sheer weight of silence broken only by the clatter of hooves, distant hammers, and the guttural murmurs of people speaking in dialects so thick they may as well be foreign tongues. You open your eyes not to the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room or the familiar glow of LED lights, but to wooden rafters warped by smoke and age, to a rush of cold air slicing through your thin modern clothing, to a straw-stuffed mattress crawling with lice, and a creaking door ajar to a world so different you would barely comprehend it. The sky is the same blue, the sun the same warmth, but every other detail screams danger, survival, and unfamiliarity. You'd probably find yourself in a one-room wattle and daub cottage shared with a peasant family who stares at you like you're either a wandering idiot or a wayward saint. The walls are patchy, the floor is compacted dirt, and the only warmth comes from a smoking central hearth with no chimney. There are no beds, just straw pallets pushed against the walls, and the smell, sour milk, unwashed bodies, mold and pig dung, is omnipresent. You wouldn't know the year, few would, most people couldn't tell you the century, let alone the day of the week, unless it was marked by a saint's feast or a local market day. Calendars were the domain of monks and scholars, and time was measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the ringing of church bells, and the changing of the seasons. Your accent would betray you immediately. Your clothing, even if simple, would be alien in cut and material, and your confusion over daily chores would make you seem witless at best and possessed at worst. The moment you failed to kneel in prayer, identify yourself by your father's trade, or explain your lack of fealty to a local lord, you'd be viewed with suspicion. Medieval people were deeply superstitious. The line between sinner, heretic, and madman was thin and dangerous, especially for strangers. If you arrived in the early Middle Ages, say the 9th or 10th century, you might be mistaken for a Norse thrall or a wandering vagrant. In the High Middle Ages, around the 12th or 13th century, your foreignness might be blamed on Saracen blood or devilry. By the 14th or 15th century, you'd risk being accused of witchcraft just by using an unfamiliar word or failing to cross yourself at the church door. You wouldn't last long without allies, and gaining allies would require labour. You'd have to prove your worth with your hands, not your words. Could you milk a goat, chop firewood, thatch a roof, skin a rabbit? You'd need to learn fast or die hungry. Forget about hot showers and clean water. You'd drink from wooden cups, eat coarse rye bread and pottage, and bathe once a season, if you were lucky. Your teeth would rot from a diet rich in grit-laced bread and low in vitamin C. Your skin would chap and crack in the cold and burn red in the summer. You'd scratch constantly from fleas and lice, and a single infected cut could kill you without antibiotics. You'd be plagued by constant hunger, and most of your waking hours would be spent working, hauling water, turning soil, feeding animals, grinding grain, or spinning wool, tasks made harder without machines, tools, or gloves. Winter would terrify you. The long months of cold and damp would stretch endlessly, with little food and even less light. Candles were precious, firewood scarcer still. People huddled together for warmth, sharing beds with siblings, elders, or livestock. Illness would sweep through like fire. Coughs became pneumonias. Fevers turned fatal. A bad harvest meant starvation. You might think to visit a doctor, but medieval medicine was rooted in Galenic theory, imbalances of the four humours treated with bloodletting, leeches and herbs of questionable efficacy. You wouldn't find pharmacies or hospitals in the modern sense. Monasteries served as rudimentary clinics, but only for those seen as worthy or curable. Barbers did surgery. Midwives relied on charms and poultices. Mental illness was either ignored or punished. The church loomed over everything. Christianity wasn't just a religion, it was law, culture, and science bundled into one powerful structure. Your failure to attend Mass or recognize saints' days would be noted. Your inability to recite the Lord's Prayer might mark you as a heathen. Everyone confessed, fasted, and feared the fires of hell with visceral intensity. Hell was not metaphor. It was a place people expected to go if they misstepped. Monks copied texts by hand, laboring for years over a single manuscript. Books were chained in churches, too rare to lend. Knowledge was controlled, guarded, and tied to Latin, a language of clergy and elite. Even if you tried to explain that you were from the future, people wouldn't understand future the way you do. Time was cyclical, not linear. History was divine plan, not cause and effect. Everything was God's will: drought, plague, war. Science would sound like sorcery. Your understanding of germs or gravity would seem blasphemous. Fire and stars were divine mysteries, not chemical reactions or celestial mechanics. A solar eclipse might spark panic. A birth defect was a sign of sin. You'd be surrounded by animals, pigs underfoot, chickens in the house, oxen in the fields. Most people lived with their animals not by choice, but because warmth and economy required it. You'd hear dogs bark, roosters crow, and carts creak at all hours. The clatter of hooves, the scream of pigs being slaughtered, the endless drone of church bells, they'd fill your ears. Streets were muddy and filled with refuse. Waste was dumped from windows into alleys. Rats were everywhere. Fleas bit constantly. Shoes were thin and soaked through daily. Your feet would blister, then callous. You'd walk miles each day to market, to church, to fields. And if you thought you could read a map or find your way back, think again. There were no street signs, few maps, and even fewer who could read them. You'd need to remember landmarks, spoken directions, and local legends. Inns were rare and expensive. Most travelers slept in barns or begged hospitality from strangers. You'd sleep under hay, on floors, next to strangers or vermin. And always there'd be the looming fear of authority. Lords owned everything. You had no rights. You'd owe taxes in grain, labour, or your daughter's dowry. You could be conscripted into labour, militia, or worse. The church could excommunicate you, the Lord could imprison you, a local bailiff or reeve could punish you for wandering or stealing. Justice was brutal. Stocks, floggings, amputations, hanging. There was no trial as you know it, just accusation and punishment. And God help you if you were a woman or seen as weak. Women were property. Marriage was arranged. Childbirth was the leading cause of death. Girls wed young, boys apprenticed early, and old age was rare. 40 was elderly. Children died constantly. Disease, starvation, accident, everything could kill. And yet, somehow people lived. They laughed, sang, told stories by firelight. They played dice, drank ale, danced at festivals. They believed in saints and miracles, prayed for rain or sun, marked the seasons with feasts. There was beauty in simplicity, a newborn lamb, a bountiful harvest, a surviving winter. You'd learn to appreciate the smallest victories, a whole loaf of bread, a night without rats, a warm cloak. If you adapted, you might survive. You'd need to forget comfort, embrace hardship, and earn trust. You'd have to learn the tools of daily life, how to gut a fish, thatch a roof, patch a tunic. You'd need to watch others and copy them, speak little, offend no one. You'd barter with eggs, mended shoes, bundles of herbs. You'd owe loyalty to someone, a lord, a priest, a guild. Perhaps you'd find work as a servant, a field hand, a washerwoman. If clever, maybe you'd apprentice to a blacksmith or baker. With luck, you'd avoid plague, war, famine, and fire. But if you slipped even once, you could fall fast. A missing tax, an angry neighbour, a misunderstood gesture, and suddenly you're in the stocks or worse. And always there'd be the aching, pulsing sense of isolation, that no one speaks your tongue, knows your world, or believes your truth. You are the only one who knows the moon landing, the internet, vaccines, skyscrapers, democracy, and none of it matters. It's just you, dirt, fire, prayer, and survival. Days turn to weeks, seasons shift, and eventually, if you live long enough, you forget the taste of soda, the sound of music through headphones, the feel of carpet. You become one of them. You kneel when they kneel, you speak their words, you fear their fears, and in time maybe, you no longer dream of your own time. Maybe you even begin to think this world, muddy, brutal, holy, is home. And so the days in that medieval world stretch onward, each one a lesson in survival, observation, and submission, and you slowly begin to adjust, not because it becomes easier, but because you realize there is no alternative. No waking up, no breaking of the spell, only forward motion through a life you never imagined would become yours, rising before dawn to the thin cries of roosters, to the metallic clang of a pail being drawn from a well, to the grumble of a stomach that's never quite full, your breath visible in the cold morning air, even in your sleep, the chill settling in your bones, because there is no insulation in walls of mud and wattle, only draught and damp, and the scratch of straw beneath coarse linen, and the hard truth that this is not a temporary misadventure, but a permanent plunge into a reality, with no doors back to the one you knew. So you begin to copy the rhythms of the household you've been absorbed into, this family, who watches you with suspicion that slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifts into pity, and then reluctant tolerance as you bungle your way through tasks they've known since childhood, mucking out the animal stall, fetching water from a creek that stinks in the summer and freezes in winter, picking lice from your collar, scraping soot from pots over the hearth, burning your hands the first few times you try to cook with firewood too green and pots too hot, burning the porridge until someone else shoves you aside with a grunt and finishes it for you, and you learn not to argue because your words carry no weight, your ideas no merit, and the only thing that gives you value is the sweat you can pour into labor, and the silence with which you accept your place at the lowest rung of the ladder, eating last, sleeping closest to the door, never speaking unless spoken to, and when you finally mimic their dialect well enough to grunt your name and nod in the right places, they start handing you more to do, heavier loads to carry, and you do it, not out of virtue, but because the world here punishes uselessness with hunger and cold, and sometimes worse, and in the village square you see that even among these humble people there is hierarchy, rigid and invisible but deeply felt, the baker who wields soft power because bread is life, the reeve who collects taxes and listens closely to gossip, the priest whose word is law not because he's godly, but because he's literate, and those who cross him risk penance, exile, or death by fire, and you learn quickly not to draw attention, not to ask too many questions about saints or relics or rules, because theology here is not philosophy, it is the spine of the world, and deviation is punished swiftly, and so when the priest asks if you've been baptized, you lie and nod, and later you carve a small cross into a stick and clutch it when others pray, imitating every genuflection and muttered phrase until your mimicry becomes muscle memory, and somehow that is enough to buy you a threadbare cloak in the winter and the occasional piece of fish on Fridays, and you begin to feel not at home but invisible, which is as close to safety as one can hope for in this time, where safety is a rare and transient thing, always threatened by storms, bad harvests, wolves or men with swords, and it is during one of these storms, when wind lashes the cottage and the animals groan in their pen, that the child of the house falls sick, and you watch helplessly as she burns with fever, her skin hot and dry, eyes rolled back, and the mother wails and prays and offers bread at the church and bleeds herself with a knife, convinced it will purge the evil humours, and you want to say it's a virus, it's dehydration, she needs clean water and rest, but you know better than to say anything, because the last time you tried to explain germs, the old man with the milky eye spat on you and muttered something about devil speech, so instead you sit by her bed and try to spoon her water, and somehow she survives, and her mother weeps in gratitude and offers you a crust of sweetened bread, and for a moment you are not a stranger but a miracle, and it is perhaps the first time you feel something like belonging, and as seasons pass you begin to understand the deeper cycles, the way the sun shifts not just across the sky, but across the lives of people tied to its rhythm, the rush of planting in spring, the exhaustion of harvest in autumn, the terror of famine in winter, the cautious celebrations of midsummer, when bonfires roar and wine is passed from hand to hand, and even the most bitter among them laugh for a night before returning to toil and silence, and you realize this life, though grueling, is not entirely joyless, that there is a kind of beauty in the simplicity of it, in the shared struggle and occasional shared triumphs, in the way people sing as they thresh wheat or pluck feathers or mend a fence, and though their songs are sad, often dirges, they are sung with conviction, and in those moments you feel time blur, as if you could almost forget the world you came from, forget the electric hum of modern life, and then someone dies, a man caught beneath a cart, crushed bones and blood in the mud, and there is no ambulance, no stretcher, just quick prayers, shallow graves, and another space at the hearth. And the others barely speak of him after the first few days, as if to mourn too long is to tempt fate, and you realize the only constant here is death, that it stalks every shadow, takes the young and the old with equal cruelty, and the people here have learned to live in its presence, the way you once lived with traffic or taxes, and one day you are summoned by the local lord, or rather his steward, because word has spread that you can read, a slip of parchment, a carved letter, something someone saw you do in a careless moment, and the steward eyes you with suspicion, but also interest, and he tests you, hands you a missive from a neighbouring estate, and watches as you stumble through the Latin, and when you finish he nods, and suddenly you are pulled from the thatched cottage, and given a place among the manor staff, a cot in the granary, bread with meat once a week, and a daily task of transcribing, inventorying, calculating tithes and levies, and you are grateful, though it comes with new dangers, for now you are seen, you have worth, but you are also more visible, more vulnerable to envy or accusation, and the other scribes whisper that you have no patron, no parish records, no known kin, and that is dangerous, so you invent a backstory, claim to be the orphaned son of a minor reeve, raised by monks, lost during a border raid, and it satisfies most, and your days now are ink-stained and candle-lit, the air thick with dust from old scrolls, and the smell of vellum, and you learn more than you ever expected, because the steward keeps letters from far-off towns, and sometimes even from abroad, and you begin to understand the vastness of the medieval world, the slow but steady veins of commerce and pilgrimage, the risks of war and banditry and plague, and once, just once, you are allowed to see a map, hand-drawn, poorly scaled, more art than geography, but it thrills you to your core because it is a rare thing, a glimpse of a world beyond the village and fields, and it makes you wonder if you could run, if you could find your way to a city, to a ship, to some monastery library where your knowledge might grant you sanctuary, and for weeks the idea burns in you, the dream of escape, until one night a fire takes the granary, and in the chaos you see how quickly order breaks, how fast suspicion turns to accusation, and a woman is blamed though she was nowhere near the flame, dragged into the square, beaten until she confesses through blood and sobs, and burned the next morning, while the priest intones verses over the smoke, and you say nothing, do nothing, because to speak is to burn, and that night you cry for the first time in months, not for her, but for yourself, for what this world has made of you, and still the days go on, and you rise again, and work again, and your Latin improves, and you begin to understand the politics between local lords, the rivalries and marriages, and subtle power plays that shape the fates of everyone beneath them, and you are careful to listen but not speak, to serve but not suggest, and in time you are sent on errands, given a mule and a sealed pouch, and ride dusty roads past forests where wolves still hunt and outlaws hide, and you begin to see how fragile civilization is here, how a single storm or skirmish can undo months of peace, and yet still people live, and trade, and wed, and pray, and when you reach a town, it is overwhelming, noise and filth and colour, stalls bursting with cloth and spices, and dried fish, jugglers and beggars and friars shouting sermons, women in rough skirts haggling over garlic, boys chasing pigs through mud, and above it all, the steeple of the church rising like a spine of authority, and you deliver your letter and return, and are not robbed or killed or accused, and it feels like a victory, and you begin to think perhaps you could survive here, not just as a shadow, but as someone with purpose, maybe even with a future, and one day you are asked to teach the Lord's youngest son his letters, and you try, stumbling through alphabets and simple verses, and the boy is cruel, spoiled, but you see in him a hunger for knowledge, and he returns each day for more, and you begin to feel pride, a sense of contribution, and then he falls sick, and the leeches don't help, and the prayers do nothing, and when he dies, the lady of the manor curses you, says it is your fault, your unnatural ideas, your witch letters, and you are locked away in a storeroom for days, no light, no food, and you believe it is the end, but then the steward speaks on your behalf, and the priest too, quietly, carefully, and you are released with warnings, and the boy is buried, and life resumes, as it always does here, with more silence, more fear, and you learn again to be small, to be invisible, to serve and endure, and never hope too much, and the seasons turn again, and you mark the years now, not by numbers, but by faces lost, roofs rebuilt, candles blessed, fields ploughed, and you dream less of your old life, forget the names of cities and devices and people you once loved, and when a stranger arrives one spring ragged, coughing, with strange words and a desperate hunger, you are the first to offer bread, the first to teach them how to kneel, how to speak, how to vanish into this brutal, beautiful, unrelenting world that has swallowed you whole and made you, against your will, one of its own. And the stranger you took in, who once reminded you of yourself with their glassy eyes and stumbling tongue and desperate clinging to some distant, vanished idea of comfort, quickly becomes another chapter in the slow erosion of whatever part of your soul still clings to the notion that all this might be reversed or escaped, for they too, like you, begin to rot and reform under the harsh rhythms of this world, shedding disbelief like skin and taking on the hardened, leathery stare of a survivor, and as you watch them cut their hand on a jagged tool and wince not from the pain but from the dread of infection, you realize with crushing certainty that adaptation is not triumph but a slow forgetting, a death by increments, and still the days go on, and you keep moving, keep bending yourself to every new task and silence, until you find yourself reciting prayers in Latin not to fit in, but because they now feel like the only true words left to you, and you catch yourself speaking to God with the same half-desperate mixture of hope and fear you once felt only for electricity or antibiotics. And when the crops fail one summer because the rains do not come, you fast and pray and join the villagers in the church, packed so tightly the air is thick with sweat and incense and the low moaning of despair, and the priest rages that the village has sinned and must repent, and names are whispered, names of girls who bore children too soon, of old women with too many cats, of a man who spoke ill of the steward, and you know these accusations are not logic but fear wearing a robe, yet you say nothing, because you have learned the price of mercy is suspicion, and the cost of truth is death. And when the rain finally comes, too late for the barley, but just in time for the root vegetables, the village holds a feast, not in joy but in exhausted gratitude, and they sing songs that have no words, just rhythmic hums and chants passed down by people long dead, and for a few hours they dance barefoot in the mud, and pass around cups of sour wine and roasted turnips, and you feel once again the strange warmth of unity, of shared breath and suffering, and it almost feels like family. And then days later, a rider comes bearing news of war in the north, and the men of the village are conscripted, yourself among them, and given spears with rusted points, and told to march under a banner whose colours you do not know, and so begins a new phase of your existence, not as a peasant or scribe or servant, but as fodder for a cause you neither chose nor understand. And the march is long and brutal, your feet blistered, your body sore from poor sleep and thinner rations, and the men around you mutter about glory and honour and vengeance, but mostly they speak of home, of wives and fields and debts. And when you finally arrive at the encampment, you see that nothing about this war is noble, just mud and fear and the smell of rot, rows of tents pitched on soggy ground, wounded men moaning, and commanders barking orders with little concern for whether you live or die. And the first skirmish comes suddenly, not as a grand battle but as chaos, shouting, arrows, the thud of bodies hitting wet earth, and the hot iron scent of blood, and you kill a man, or at least you think you do, because your spear sinks into something soft and you feel resistance, and then nothing, and later you cannot recall his face, only the look in his eyes when he realized it was over, and the taste of bile in your throat. And in the aftermath, as the survivors sit around fires eating dry bread and wine mixed with water, no one speaks of the dead, only of the living, and who will tend the goats now, and whether this land was worth spilling blood for. And the campaign stretches on, months of rain and disease and boredom and fear, and when winter comes the snow kills more pain than swords, and you watch your comrades die in their sleep, curled like children, lips blue and eyes wide, and when the order comes to retreat, it is almost a mercy, though you return with fewer than you left with, and those who do come back are not greeted with fanfare, but suspicion. What did they see? What did they bring back? What sins have they now committed? And the steward takes your name and gives you a new post, this time tending the ledger of the village tithe. And so you begin again, recording barley and eggs and sheep owed to the manor, and you now have a room of your own, small but private, with a wooden door and a narrow window, and a stool and a chest, and you think perhaps this is the pinnacle of comfort in this age, and you grow accustomed to solitude, speaking only when necessary, your words measured, your presence unremarkable, and still the world turns, the seasons shift, and plague comes, not the great one yet, but a local sickness, a fever that sweeps through the village and leaves half its children dead, and several elders too. And once again the whispers start, and once again the priest calls for repentance, and you are spared only because you are now useful, now known, and you watch as the midwife is taken in the night, her house burned, and you weep for her because she once gave you a salve for your sore hand and asked for nothing in return, and her only crime was being being a woman who knew herbs, and you write her name in your ledger in the margin where no one will read it, and sometimes you whisper it before sleep, as if that will keep some piece of her alive. And in spring a nobleman passes through, his retinue shimmering with cloths dyed in colours you have not seen in years, their hands soft, their eyes bored, and he looks at you as if you are furniture, not flesh, and orders his men to take what the village owes, and more besides, and you watch them strip the barns and haul away sacks of barley and wheels of cheese and smoked fish, and you can say nothing, because power here is not justice, it is simply the will to act without fear of consequence. And after they leave the village mourns in silence, its anger swallowed like sour milk, and the fields are sown again, and you help with the planting now, because there are fewer men, and every hand is needed, and the work is hard but clear, and your body becomes lean and weathered and strong, and your dreams grow quieter, and you no longer think in the voice you once had, no longer hear the buzz of machines in your memory, only the wind through grass, and the crunch of boots on frost. And years pass, not marked by birthdays or holidays, but by births and burials, harvests and famines, and you begin to lose track of how long it has been since you woke in that straw bed for the first time, and the people no longer ask where you came from, only whether you will help fix the roof, tend the sick, read a letter from a distant cousin, and you do these things, and slowly they call you not stranger, but brother, and one day a girl smiles at you, not the smile of courtship, not yet, but of familiarity, and you smile back, and your chest aches, not with longing for the past, but with fear of the future, because you know now how easily this world takes what it gives. And when she falls ill some months later, you walk to the next village in the rain to fetch a healer, and she lives, and her mother calls you brave, and her father gives you a knife of your own, and you know it is the highest compliment a man here can receive, and still you do not wed, not because you do not want to, but because some part of you still feels like a shadow in this world, like a ghost walking among the living, though that part fades more with each passing day, and sometimes you catch your reflection in the river and barely recognize yourself, the beard, the lines, the dirt, the scars, and you wonder if the person you once were still exists, or if he died, the moment you opened your eyes to the sound of chickens and creaking wood, and when you finally hear of a city to the south with a library and monks who copy books by the dozen, you are tempted for the first time in years to leave, to seek out something more, and you pack your things, bread, cheese, your knife, a scrap of parchment with your own name written on it, and begin to walk, past the fields and the churches and the blackened remains of burned cottages, and for days you travel, sleeping under trees and beside roads, until the city appears on the horizon, its walls high and daunting, its gates manned by guards who look you over and wave you through, and inside you are swallowed by noise and humanity, by smells and languages and customs that make your village seem like a cradle, and you find the monastery and offer your skills, and they test you and accept you and give you a cell and a robe and ink and paper, and you spend your days now copying words you barely understand, but they feel sacred, even when they are only lists of names or grain inventories, and you grow old there, your hands curled from labour, your back bent, but your mind sharp, and sometimes, late at night, you remember your old world, the one with glass and wires and hums, and you weep not for what you lost, but for how easily you stopped needing it. And so the years slipped further into the mire of memory, and what once was modern, familiar, and indispensable, the chatter of electric voices, the blinking lights, the warmth of central heating, the distant, sweet hum of tires over smooth asphalt, became little more than the fragile dreams of another life. and the cell within the monastery, cold and narrow though it was, began to feel like a sanctuary more than a prison, because at least here there was structure and silence, and the gentle scratching of quills that filled the scriptorium with the song of purpose, and you became a fixture among the scribes, a man with a steady hand and no past, one who asked few questions and made few errors, and in time even the abbot began to nod at your passing, murmuring words of approval when your work returned clean and aligned, and your Latin became natural, your marginalia sparing and elegant, and you took small pride in the care with which you formed the strokes of letters that would long outlast your own bones, and sometimes you copied verses from the Psalms, and though you remembered little of religion from your old life, you found in those ancient songs a kind of bitter beauty, a reflection of the fear and awe and trembling hope that filled every corner of this world, and when pilgrims came through the monastery's guest hall, wrapped in cloaks and dust and holy ambition, they would sometimes speak of strange happenings in far places, eclipses, blood rains, battles, and wonders, and you would listen with the quiet attentiveness of one who knows that wonder and horror wear the same face here, and every miracle demands a price. And when one of them spoke of a new sickness blooming in the ports to the south, a coughing death, a swelling of the neck, a blackening of the skin, you felt your hands go cold, even as your face remained impassive, because you had studied enough accounts in the library to recognize the signs, to know that plague travels faster than fear, and when it finally arrived in your city, slipping in like a thief in the night, you knew before the bells tolled that it would not be stopped, and so it began, the coughing, the bleeding, the swelling of groins and armpits, the flight of the rich to their countryside manors, the barricading of streets, the burning of linens, the unceasing toll of funerary bells, until the bell ringers themselves fell dead, and the bodies piled up in cartloads, and the chants of monks grew hoarse with overuse, and the grave pits deepened until their stench overtook the incense, and still the plague marched on, devouring rich and poor alike. And you stayed behind, not out of bravery, but because there was nowhere else to go, and what was one more risk in a life already borrowed, and you copied the names of the dead in black ink, row upon row, until the pages themselves felt heavy with sorrow. And one day the brother who shared your cell fell ill, and you watched him die slowly, gently, in a stupor of fever and prayer, and you sat by his side through the night, whispering fragments of memory to him, not just scripture, but songs and phrases from the world before, words whose meaning he could not know, but whose tone may have brought him peace. And when he passed, you buried him yourself, and marked his grave with a flat stone, and then you waited for your own turn, because surely it would come, and yet it didn't, and day by day the death waned, the city emptied, the monastery fell to silence, and when spring broke, it did so not with joy, but with stunned disbelief. And you emerged blinking from the long tunnel of pestilence like a man reborn, though no child, no friend, no neighbour remained who knew you from before, and now the monks who remained treated you with a new deference, a quiet reverence, for you had walked through the valley and emerged untouched, and they whispered that perhaps the Lord had spared you for some purpose, and you did not contradict them, for in truth you no longer knew what was accident, what was destiny, and what was simply survival, and in the years that followed you became the monastery's archivist, the one who knew the names of all who had passed through its gates, the one who could find the document, the deed, the charter buried in its labyrinthine shelves, and sometimes noblemen sent their sons to be educated by the monks, and you taught them to write, to read, to think carefully, and never speak carelessly, and one of them, a boy with bright eyes and a curious tongue, reminded you of the child you once were, and you taught him more than letters. You taught him to question gently in secret, and when he returned to his family, now grown, he sent books and donations to the abbey, and in those texts you found echoes of your own long-buried thoughts, and you smiled, not in pride, but in quiet vindication, and so your legend grew, and stories began to form around your name. Some called you the Dust Monk, others said you were a penitent magician, a scholar from the East, a saint of memory, and you neither confirmed nor denied these tales, because truth had become a fluid thing, and you had worn so many masks that you no longer knew which one was your face, and in time your hands grew too stiff to hold the quill, your eyes too dim to see the page, and you took on an apprentice, a sharp boy with quick fingers and a hunger for ink, and you taught him as you had taught yourself, with discipline, with patience, and with the knowledge that books are not just vessels of words, but graves for thoughts. And one winter, when the snows came earlier than expected, and the roofs bowed under their weight, you fell ill, not the sharp fever of plague, but the slow creeping weariness of age, and the brothers laid you in your cell with fresh straw and warm cloth. And you knew at last that your time had arrived, and in those final days you drifted between sleep and waking, and in your dreams you walked again through the streets of your first home, bright with electric light and soft with the smell of detergent and pavement after rain, and you saw your family, your friends, people whose faces you had not remembered in years, and they smiled at you, said nothing, only reached out their hands, and when you opened your eyes, the apprentice was sitting by your bed, murmuring the psalms in the low rhythm you had taught him, and you smiled, because it was enough. And when the breath left your body, it did so quietly, without fear, and they buried you in the monastery's garden, beneath a yew tree older than any man, and they carved your name, not the one you were born with, but the one they had given you, and in time the wind and moss wore it away, and only the tree remembered you, and in that peaceful, rooted silence, you became a part of the land, of the story, of the long, unbroken thread that stretches from one forgotten life to another, each marked not by glory or greatness, but by the simple, stubborn act of enduring, of waking each day to face a world that will never understand you, and learning to live within it, all the same. And so the years unfolded like the pages of the very manuscripts you had spent your life copying, binding, preserving, with ink-stained hands and aching fingers, and as the monastery settled into its cycle of chants and seasons, with new novices entering, and old brothers departing quietly in the night, the memory of you faded, not with cruelty, but with the inevitable soft erasure that time grants to all things left unspoken, and the boy you once taught, now a man of influence, continued his patronage to the abbey, never speaking of how much he had learned from a figure others now remembered, only as a quiet scribe who rarely laughed but always listened, and while the world beyond the monastery changed, kingdoms shifting, flags rising and falling, new diseases arriving with ships that brought spices and silk and death in equal measure, the brothers behind stone walls lived on, praying, planting, and illuminating new volumes in the scriptorium, where your hand once trembled across the vellum, and yet the world outside did not stop, nor did it forget the age it had endured, and those who lived through the plague became the chroniclers of its aftermath. And as Europe staggered into a new century, shaped by labour shortages and upheavals of power, by peasants demanding wages and lords struggling to assert dominion, your manuscript entries, simple, neat, precise, were studied by later eyes who sought to understand what life had felt like during the darkness. And though your name was barely known, your work survived, bearing silent testimony to your passage through a world that you had not been born into, yet had come to know more intimately than the one that bore you. And while you lay in your quiet grave beneath the yew. Above you the roots crept and coiled. The birds returned with each spring, and the abbey gardens blossomed again and again, watched over by men who had no idea who you truly were. And in this strange anonymity you found the peace that eluded you in both lives. For the earth does not care if you came from the stars or the soil. It receives all equally, folding every lost name into its embrace, with neither judgment nor regret. But while your bones rested, the story did not end, for in the city nearby, new generations rose who did not remember the plague, only the silence that followed it. And among them was a young boy named Alric, born to a baker and a woman who had once served as a washer for the monks. And though Alric's early years were filled with the scent of flour and the yeasty tang of dough rising in pans, he was not made for ovens or the clatter of pans, but for books. And when he was caught sneaking into the back of a merchant's cart to read the prayer book left forgotten on the seat, the merchant did not punish him but brought him to the monastery, saying, "This one's got ink in his blood." And the brothers, always in need of eager hands, took him in, gave him robes too large and sandals that blistered his feet, and set him to sweeping the scriptorium, where one day he found, in the dust of the bottom shelf, a manuscript bound in rough leather with no title, only a single line scrawled in the margin of the first page in a hand both elegant and strangely modern. The world was not always as it is, and he read, slowly at first, then with growing hunger, the chronicles you had written in secret during your last years. The private record of your strange arrival, your struggle, your silence, your survival, and the truth struck him not as madness but as revelation, for he too had always felt the world was too heavy, too dark, as though some veil hung between him and everything around him. And your words gave that feeling shape, voice, and when he approached the abbot with questions, the old man dismissed them gently, saying only, "Men sometimes write stories to endure what is otherwise unbearable." But Ulrich was not satisfied with dismissal, and he began to transcribe your hidden writings by candlelight, copying the truth you had buried beneath layers of prayer and obedience. And in doing so, he carried your voice forward, unknowingly rekindling the spark of a story that had refused to die, even when its teller had long since turned to dust. Ulrich would go on to become not just a monk but a chronicler, a thinker, and eventually a quietly revered figure in his own right, one who dared to suggest that the world was larger than the church bell's toll. That time might stretch beyond the chronicles of saints and kings, that somewhere in the vast reach of creation, men had once spoken with glass in their hands and travelled without horses. And while most of his peers found these ideas amusing at best and blasphemous at worst, a few listened, and among those few were the next generation of scribes, who took Alric's words as seeds, planted them in new texts, in letters and marginalia, until across the continent, in distant monasteries and hidden archives, faint echoes of your strange journey surfaced in the footnotes, and whispers of those who dared to imagine a world not ruled by superstition and sword, but by the slow return of knowledge. And as the age of monks gave way to the age of thinkers, to men who studied the stars and cut open cadavers and questioned the motions of the heavens, the spirit of your memory, if not your name, was alive, a silent ghost moving among scholars, keeping vigil over a world slowly awakening from the long dream of darkness. And though no statue was ever built in your honour, though no feast day marked your passing, the chain of consequences you set in motion, by surviving, by enduring, by writing, unfolded through time, like a thread in a vast and unseen loom, tugging gently at the corner of history, until, many centuries later, in the bustling heart of a city lit, not by torches but electric light, A researcher uncovered a weathered folio in the archives of a crumbling monastery, and within its pages found a strange and poetic testimony, part history, part confession, written in a hand that puzzled paleographers for its blend of early medieval syntax with strange turns of phrase, almost prophetic in tone. And when the researcher, intrigued, began to study it more deeply, she found herself haunted by its closing lines. I did not belong to this age, yet it claimed me as its own, and in claiming me it made me what I could never have been in the age I lost. And she could not explain the cold shiver those words sent through her spine, nor why the name signed at the bottom, though blurred and half-faded, seemed so strangely familiar, and thus the tale passed on again, not as proof, not as gospel, but as possibility, a door cracked open for one more mind in one more era, asking again the question you had once lived: what if you woke up in another time? And though no one could answer it fully, the echoes of your life, your struggle, your strange silent endurance, continued to hum beneath the surface of history, not erased, not forgotten, but woven into the very fabric of human memory, where all the greatest truths live, not shouted from towers, but whispered in the margins, waiting to be heard. And yet even as time swept onward, reshaping the landscape of memory, rebuilding towns over buried ruins, erecting cathedrals where old temples once stood, and paving over fields where monks once bent to the earth in prayer, the faint residue of your presence lingered, not in monuments or relics, but in the soft patterns that human lives left behind when touched by something extraordinary, like the subtle pull of the moon on a tide, or the way a forgotten melody might echo across centuries, caught in the throat of a child who never learned the song but hums it anyway. It was in this quiet continuity that your story refused to die, not because it was known, but because it was felt. Because in every age there are those who look at the world and sense, however faintly, that something is askew, that they are walking through a dream they did not begin and cannot entirely shape, that behind the veil of language and routine and duty lies a question too vast for doctrine and too sacred for certainty. And it was these seekers, scholars, artists, scribes, and eventually in modern times, programmers and poets and wandering minds lost in books and night skies, who kept your spirit alive, though they never knew your name, only the ache you carried and the courage with which you bore it. And so it happened, as stories often do, that in the city of Florence, during the slow and stubborn birth of what we now call the Renaissance, a young apprentice to a printer, caught in the laborious process of typesetting pages for a philosophical tract, stumbled across a peculiar margin note written in a hand unlike any he'd seen, a strange symbol scrawled beside the printed words, a symbol that echoed through the centuries and had once been etched in the edge of your own secret folios, and something about it stopped him cold, as if he had heard a distant bell ring, a name he'd forgotten in a dream, and he copied it, just for himself, in the margin of a scrap of paper he later tucked into his apron. And this tiny act, so seemingly small, so easily erased, became one more link in a long and invisible chain of memory. From Florence it travelled again, in ink and whispers, carried westward by tradesmen and printers and thinkers whose names we've largely forgotten, until it found its way to a university tucked in the hills of France, where a mathematician obsessed with patterns used the symbol as part of a cipher he believed would unlock divine truths hidden in the geometry of the world. And though his work was never fully understood by his peers, and though he died without acclaim, his notebooks were preserved by a student who later went on to teach a young boy named Pascal, who carried some shard of that symbolic strangeness into his own writings on God, reason, and infinity. And while your name never appeared in those pages, your influence had rippled outward once again, like a stone cast into still water that keeps breaking the surface long after it's vanished beneath. and it was perhaps in this way that you achieved something more lasting than fame or praise. You became part of the architecture of thought itself, part of the quiet scaffolding that holds up our collective striving toward understanding. And as centuries passed and the printing press gave way to the steam engine, and the plough to the factory, and the monastery to the metropolis, your story persisted. Hidden in footnotes, encoded in symbols, whispered in dreams, not as legend, but as a kind of question, as if the very act of wondering about time and self and displacement was itself your true legacy. In London during the 19th century, in the damp and gaslit corridors of a museum packed with relics and oddities from every corner of the old world, a young woman named Elsie, employed as a cataloguer of ancient texts, came upon a tattered volume misfiled among a shelf of heretical writings, and as she leafed through its vellum pages, she noted at first the usual pieties and records of harvests, but then between two entries on rainfall and crop failures, she found a curious page unlike the others, filled not with Latin prayers, but with a rambling meditation in a different tone altogether, introspective, wandering, filled with metaphors drawn from stars, machines, and strange lights, that the writer called windows without wood and lamps without flame, and though her superior dismissed it as nonsense and bade her return it to storage, she copied the passage in her notebook, feeling some inexplicable resonance with the words, and years later, when she became one of the first women permitted to lecture at a small university, she included that passage in a talk on the psychology of mysticism, presenting it not as truth, but as artifact, and the audience, though puzzled, was stirred, for in the age of rail and gaslight, men had begun to ask questions again about the nature of time and identity, and your words, soft, uncertain, unclaimed, arrived like the breeze through a half-open window, unsettling the dust in a room that had grown too sure of itself. Elsie's notes were eventually published in a small collection titled Reflections on Lost Time, and though the book sold poorly in its day, it found renewed life in the early 20th century when a French poet named Marcel chanced upon it in a second-hand shop and found himself so moved by the strange tone of the meditation that he modelled part of his own monumental work on memory and longing after it, thus weaving yet another invisible thread between your silent journey and the art that followed it, and from there your influence leapt again through readers and thinkers and dreamers whose minds were primed by war and disillusionment to consider the fragility of the self, the pliability of time, and it reached even into the back rooms of science, where early theorists of time travel and quantum mechanics, men with wild eyes and cluttered blackboards, spoke not only of particles and probabilities but also of memory, of perception, of consciousness itself as a traveller through unseen dimensions. And while none of them cited you, some felt your presence, for the questions you had asked in the scriptorium, in the chill mornings and candlelit nights, were the same they now whispered in laboratories and lecture halls. And then, inevitably, your story found its way into fiction, as stories do, because somewhere, someone, a young writer perhaps, leafing through their grandmother's old books, read a translated fragment of your account, and was so struck by the loneliness in your voice, the humility with which you had survived your exile from one time to another, that they wrote a novel based loosely on it, setting their protagonist adrift in medieval England with only modern knowledge and a burning desire not to dominate, but simply to belong. And though critics called it fanciful and flawed, it captured the imaginations of thousands, then millions, until adaptations followed, in film and television, and soon the idea of waking up in another time became a genre unto itself, spawning tales of time travellers, displaced souls, lost futures and altered pasts, and each one, whether it knew it or not, carried a bit of your truth within it, not the spectacle, not the invention, but the ache, the quiet terror of dislocation, the sacred hunger to make sense of the world when every familiar marker has vanished, and in this way your once private agony became a shared myth. A new story told in old bones, centuries after you first awoke in that filthy alley with the stink of wood smoke and dung in your nostrils, long after your hands had forgotten how to swipe a screen or write an email or lock a door. The world you had left behind returned in echoes, slowly, piece by piece. Not because it resurrected the past you knew, but because it finally began to ask the questions you had lived. How does one endure a world they do not recognize? How does the soul adapt when stripped of all context? What remains when memory fades and language fails, and every habit must be relearned? And in the 21st century, when satellites circled a planet humming with digital noise, when people walked around with entire libraries in their pockets and spoke across oceans with the ease of breath, the story you had once whispered to yourself in the shadows of a monastery wall lived again, told now in podcasts, in novels, in simulation theory discussions and speculative journals, in online forums where strangers debated whether consciousness could drift between timelines or whether dreams were echoes of lives unlived. And in all these places, though no one called you by name, you were there, your question pulsing just beneath the surface. What if you woke up in another time and had to survive not by brilliance, not by domination, but by patience, humility, observation, and the quiet power of simply remaining? And so the long arc of your journey, beginning in a sudden gasp beneath the stars of an unfamiliar sky, and stretching through monastic silence, plague-ravaged streets, candle-lit scriptoriums, and the hidden channels of intellectual inheritance, reached its strange and silent conclusion, not with the ringing of bells or the chisel of stone, but with the tap of a key, the flicker of a screen, the moment when someone somewhere stumbled across your story yet again, and for a heartbeat, in the hush between their breath and the next line they read, felt that uncanny shiver of recognition, the knowing without knowing, the echo of a voice saying, "I have been there too." And so your story lived, not in history books or encyclopedias, but in the minds of those still asking the question you once asked, still peering through the veil of time, still wondering whether in some other life, they too had once awakened on a bed of straw, with only memory and silence for company, and the long strange task of learning how to live again. And even as the world you once knew faded beyond recall, the soil of that medieval time had long since claimed your footprints, and the places you had wandered, unknowingly writing your presence into the story of those centuries, had grown and evolved, their wooden buildings replaced by stone, their narrow paths widened into streets, and their people changed with the slow beat of history, yet somewhere within the echoes of old abbey ruins and the curling smoke from hearths that had never seen electricity, the essence of your passing still stirred, for you had lived there, not merely survived, but altered, adapted, absorbed into the fabric of life so completely that no one would have known you did not belong, and yet you always had, in that strange in-between way, suspended between centuries like dust caught in sunbeams through a chapel window, you had become something of a myth, even in your own lifetime, the quiet figure who always seemed to know more than was possible, who could name herbs before the apothecary did, who saw the stars not as signs from saints, but as patterns of vast, impersonal movements, and though you spoke rarely of your origin, the air around you sometimes carried the chill of a truth too large for words, and those few who knew you well sensed it, sensed that you moved like someone walking underwater, every gesture just a little more deliberate, every pause more loaded, every kindness strangely timeless, as though you were already mourning the world before it ended. And in the later years of your medieval life, when your hair had greyed and your voice had softened with age, you became something of a teacher, not in the formal sense, but as a presence people sought when their own sense of reality buckled beneath the weight of famine or disease or death, and you spoke to them not in riddles or prophecy, but in the plain, Hard truths of survival, how to dig a well away from the latrine, how to preserve food through winter, how to avoid the fevers that came with spring thaws, and they listened because you always seemed to have answers, not from books but from some other well of knowledge that no other soul in the village possessed, and though they may have whispered that you had once been a magician, or touched by an angel, or perhaps cursed and bound to walk the earth endlessly, they loved you still, because whatever mystery surrounded your life, it never eclipsed your goodness, your gentleness, your ability to be present, even when the world was unraveling. Children were especially drawn to you, perhaps because they saw in your eyes the same wonder they felt at the stars, and you told them stories, not of cell phones or skyscrapers or airplanes, for those things had long since become dreams, even to you, faded and foreign, but of other lands and peoples, of the ways humans had always tried to understand the divine, the land, the sky, and in your stories they heard something ancient and sacred, though they could never name what it was. When plague came again, this time with sharper teeth, you did not flee as others did. You remained, helping to bury the dead, to boil water, to counsel the grieving, and in this way your legacy deepened not in legend, but in the bones of the town itself, in the quiet strength with which people endured, inspired by your example. You buried friends, apprentices, neighbors, and even the woman who had once loved you, though she had never asked you to explain the strange sadness in your eyes when you watched the sunset. By then you had stopped trying to make sense of how you'd come to this time, or whether you would ever leave it. The dream of returning had passed into a memory, then into something more akin to prayer, and eventually even that dissolved, leaving only the rhythm of days, the small rituals of life, the morning walk through the dew-wet field, the smell of fresh bread from the hearth, the feel of a child's hand slipping into yours. There was in the end a peace to be found in relinquishing the need for answers, in simply becoming part of the turning earth, of the cycle that fed lambs and wolves alike. When your time finally came quietly in the early spring, after a brief illness that took your strength like the ebbing tide, you were buried not in consecrated ground, for the old priest who outlived you knew not what rites to use for one such as you, but under the great oak near the edge of the village, the same one you had once sat beneath with parchment and ink, drawing strange diagrams from memory, and trying to map a world you no longer belonged to. They carved no name on the stone, only a symbol, a peculiar spiral you had once doodled absent-mindedly, which to them meant nothing, but to you had been a fragment of some old circuit, or an ancient atom rendered in art. They remembered you as the wise one, the quiet healer, the star-teller, and your grave became a place people visited when they needed to remember that time, though brutal, did not always erase the good. Years passed. The village changed, roads were laid, books were printed, wars came and went, and your story, without intention, moved with the people who had once known you, like pollen carried on a breeze, some to London, some to Dublin, others across the sea. Generations later, a man in the early 20th century, an amateur historian with a fascination for folklore, interviewed an elderly woman in a pub near the remnants of what had once been your village. She spoke of a tale passed down in her family, about a man who came from nowhere, who never seemed to age like the others, who knew things he should not have known, and who taught people how to live wisely and kindly before dying beneath the oak. The historian wrote it down, not knowing what to make of it, and included it as a footnote in a book that would go out of print within a decade, and yet that note was later read by a young student who would go on to study mythology, who began collecting such stories of time slip and displacement across cultures, who saw patterns emerging, always the same kind of figure, always the same kind of ache, and he began to wonder, privately, if they were not just metaphors, but some echo of real dislocation, of people who had somehow crossed through cracks in time. He published papers, theories, speculative essays that drew mockery from some and fascination from others, and your story, or rather its husk, travelled again, this time as a curiosity among those who believed in the strange porosity of time. And all the while, as the 20th century rushed onward into technology and war and revolution and digital wonder, the story of you, as faint as a smudge in the margin of a forgotten book, moved through the collective imagination. Artists painted it without knowing, in oil and charcoal, and later, pixels. Poets heard it in their dreams. Programmers in the 1990s created games and simulations based on that old idea. What if you woke up in medieval times, never suspecting how close they came to your truth? And perhaps, as the world digitized and every relic of the analog began to flicker like a fading candle, some fragment of you flickered with it, embedded not in servers or data streams, but in the quiet parts of the human mind that resist being mapped, the places where dreams still root themselves, where old stories are told to new children, and where the question you once lived, what if you awoke in another world, still haunts the space between waking and sleep. And it may be that in some future time, when the earth has changed again, when cities lie buried beneath green, and language has shifted so far from its roots that even our names are unrecognizable, someone will uncover the bones beneath the oak and wonder who this person was who died alone, far from any marked grave, beneath a tree older than the cathedral down the hill. Perhaps they will find a fragment of parchment sealed in a clay jar, with writing none can quite decipher, but which carries the cadence of a heart that once beat in our rhythm. And maybe they will know, in some deep, unexplainable way, that whoever lies there was not lost but found, not a wanderer but a witness, not a relic of the past but a whisper from the future sent backwards through time. And if they are quiet enough to hear it, if they still carry that ancient ache, the longing to belong, the hunger to understand, the sorrow of impermanence, then perhaps they, too, will know your story, not because it is written, but because it is lived, because it is lived, because it is the story of being human, out of place, out of time, yet always, somehow, enduring. And in that moment of deepest dusk, as the world exhaled around your resting place, and the stars above traced their eternal pathways across the sky, unchanged, since the days you first stared up from that unfamiliar hay-strewn loft, the quiet continuity of your journey rippled outward, a silent hymn stitched into the very breath of the land. For though time had moved, and the world had bent itself into new shapes and languages and boundaries, there remained in the heart of every human that unspoken question, the echo of your arrival into a world long gone, that primal tremble at the idea of waking not just out of sleep, but into an entire lifetime, unrecognizable yet real, of living without the comforts of clocks, the hum of engines, the soft glow of electric warmth, and instead rising each day to the shrill crow of a rooster, stepping into a world governed by seasons, superstition, and the slow labour of hands upon soil, and still finding in it, against every modern instinct, a raw beauty so persistent it reshaped your soul. Even after the body was gone, and the earth had swallowed your bones, the narrative did not end, for somewhere, somehow, others began to dream the dream you once lived, and the idea of waking in the past took root again, not as fantasy, but as a kind of yearning, a desire to be reduced, to be reshaped by necessity, to become closer to the earth, to people, to pain, to meaning. And so, centuries later, a child in a luminous, humming metropolis, far removed from the silence of forests or the call of distant church bells, lay in bed staring at the ceiling of her apartment, the muted sounds of traffic crawling through the air ducts, the soft light of her tablet flickering beside her as she drifted into dreams not of space or screens or steel, but of hooves on cobblestone, of voices shouting in markets rich with smells of cheese, sweat, iron and ash, of nights beneath straw roofs, of candlelight warming the wooden walls of a peasant's home, while outside the wind howled like something ancient and watchful, and though she could not say why, the dream felt familiar, like something she had always known but forgotten, like a song sung in another life, and when she awoke she felt not disturbed but full, not afraid but reverent, as though she had touched something larger than her. Perhaps that child grew and wrote stories of time-lost travelers, of lives spent in simpler yet harder worlds, and those stories reached others, igniting in them the same pulse of recognition you once felt when first stepping barefoot onto muddy medieval ground, the sensation not of being lost but of returning, of being humbled by the raw force of history and being shaped anew by it. Even scholars, decades or centuries later, would gather around the bones found near that ancient oak, puzzled by the foreign weave of cloth fragments, the anomalies in isotope readings, the strange curve of the molars suggesting a diet inconsistent with the region's fare, some suggesting an elaborate hoax, others arguing for the presence of a long-forgotten traveller from lands far beyond Europe, but none guessing the real truth, that the person buried there had not merely crossed borders but centuries, that you had once lived in a time you had no birthright to, had once touched hands with plague-ridden mothers, helped salt fish by the riverbanks, shared cider with blacksmiths as sparks flew into the night, had sat through endless masses in a language not your own, and watched the world turn more slowly, more brutally, yet no less wondrously than the one you had left behind. Your life had become a tapestry thread caught between eras, no longer pulled forward or backward, but knotted in the fabric, forever present, even when invisible, and still the world turned. The medieval fields you once walked became cultivated estates, then abandoned land during economic collapses, then reclaimed during new wars, then sold to developers who paved roads and laid foundations for quiet, featureless suburbs. Somewhere in one of those identical homes, a woman sat on her porch with a history book in her lap, reading an offhand mention of a mysterious burial beneath an ancient tree, thought to be centuries older than the settlement itself, and something in her stirred, not fear or fascination, but familiarity, as though she had met the soul buried there in a dream, or across 1,000 unremembered lives. She marked the page, not knowing why, and carried the story with her in her mind like a fossil dead, but not meaningless. Meanwhile, across oceans, in a school where holograms replaced books and history was taught through simulations so real they blurred the line between lesson and experience, a boy paused during a medieval reconstruction and stared too long at the avatar of a healer speaking to a sick child beneath a tree, and something in the animation, the way the figure stood, the odd kindness in the expression, the strange precision of his words, felt more real than the program should allow, and he found himself wondering, for the first time, whether someone had lived this, truly lived it, and whether memory could somehow pass through more than just genes or books, but through collective dreams, through the blood-deep intuition that life, no matter the era, always whispers the same questions, always sings the same quiet, unanswerable melodies. And perhaps one day, in a world so distant it hardly resembles the one you knew, a machine or a mind beyond imagining will reconstruct the past with such precision that it stumbles, accidentally, impossibly upon your life, not as a myth, not as a theory, but as a record, an anomalous existence, untraceable yet undeniable, a single life that stood slightly apart from the rhythm of the 14th century, whose syntax and knowledge betrayed origins far stranger than any known migration could explain, and in that moment, whoever, or whatever, finds that truth may not understand it, but they will feel it. The way a violin string hums even after the bow is gone, the way stories survive even when tongues forget how to speak them. They will know, in their own way, that someone once stepped outside of time, not to change it, not to dominate it, but simply to live it, to endure and suffer and love and teach and be buried under an oak, whose roots still curl protectively around a history too fragile to be written in stone. So it is that your life in medieval times, begun in confusion, tempered in hardship, softened by human contact, and sealed in the dirt of an age long past, became more than an anomaly. It became a testament, not to magic, or science or fate, but to the relentless adaptability of the human soul. You proved, without ever intending to, that identity is not fixed by era or technology, or even origin, but by the capacity to belong, to contribute, to care, to find rhythm in the chaos of any age. You were never meant to be a savior, or a prophet, or even a story, but you became all three, not through grand gestures or miracles, but through quiet persistence, through living well in the face of the unknown. And though the medieval world is long gone, its bells silenced, its banners rotted, its gods reshaped, the echo of your passage through it remains, not in records or ruins, but in the feeling someone gets when staring into a fire, or kneeling in soil, or hearing an old song and suddenly weeping without knowing why. That is where you live now, in the spaces between certainty and mystery, in the pause between heartbeat and breath, in the eternal dream of what it means to wake, not just from sleep, but into the wide, aching brilliance of another world. And even as your presence in that distant time had faded into dust, into the undergrowth of forests long cleared, and the tilled soil of fields now buried beneath glass cities, the truth of what you endured continued to ripple like light, under deep water, elusive but persistent, for the memory of you lived not in ink or parchment, not in stone or scripture, but in the half-forgotten habits of generations that followed. In the way a woman stirred her stew clockwise 3 times before tasting it, in the way a boy touched a wooden doorframe twice for luck, in the stories of the stranger who healed, passed down in garbled oral histories in hamlets that no longer bore their original names, in a regional saying no one remembered the meaning of, but spoke with a reverent smirk. And though you did not intend it, your life had become folklore, not the kind sung by minstrels for coin, but the quiet sort that lives in the kitchen and the barn, that hums through the air in candle-lit silence, that comforts during childbirth or lingers on the breath of someone dying. And as generations passed, the you that once awoke, confused in a medieval loft, dazed by the smoke of the hearth and the chill of the stone walls, slowly transformed in memory's retelling, becoming not a modern lost in the past, but a timeless figure who simply appeared, taught, healed, helped, and vanished. And there was power in that simplicity, in being remembered not for inventions or weapons or crowns, but for the texture of your kindness, the shape of your listening, the way you stood beside others in storms without seeking shelter for yourself. In some retellings you were a woman with knowledge of herbs who came from the woods after a vision, in others a man who could speak to birds and heal fevers with only a touch, in others still a spirit of the old tree who had taken human form, and children hearing these stories centuries later would feel both wonder and fear, as all good stories demand, but somewhere inside them a truth would stir, that rare and sacred intuition that such a person, whether legend or not, had once truly lived and breathed, not beyond the reach of mortals, but among them, wounded and imperfect, and in those children, in their curious questions and make-believe games. You lived again. You had not chosen to become a story. You had merely tried to survive, to help when you could, to understand a world where death was near and gods were everywhere and laughter could be snatched away by famine before the week was done, and in doing so you had become something more enduring than you could have imagined. And still time passed. The oak tree above your grave was eventually struck by lightning during a violent storm in the early 1700s. Its upper branches sheared and scorched, but its trunk remained, gnarled and thick and strange, too stubborn to fall. Locals said it would never die because it protected someone, or perhaps because someone had once protected it, and they began to leave offerings again. Not Christian ones, but old symbols, bread crusts, feathers, knotted ribbons, little bones of birds, all left anonymously, quietly, like prayers whispered into a wind no one could name. A traveller passing through once wrote about it in his journal, noting the curious pagan rites still practiced by simple folk, though he did not guess the deeper reason why they did so, and that journal, when published, sparked a flurry of interest in rural mysticism, long before the 19th century romanticized the medieval past as something beautiful and noble, forgetting the stench, the blood, the hunger, the cold. But if you had still been alive to read their books and see the oil paintings of shining knights and blushing maidens, you might have smiled, not with mockery, but with that weary affection one has for a child who builds palaces out of sand, for you knew the truth behind those myths. The sweat beneath the armour, the lice in the golden hair, the desperate prayers spoken not in Latin but in cracked whispers behind smoke-darkened doors. You would have known the farmers who buried their children in shallow graves before winter could starve them, the women who sang to their husbands as they died of infected wounds from wooden splinters, the beggars whose leprosy made them invisible and yet still human. You had eaten with them, wept with them, laughed with them, and now, somehow, the age you had once feared would kill you had become your home, the place your bones chose to remain when the world moved on, and perhaps there was no greater measure of belonging than that your body had rested in a foreign century and become not an outsider's corpse, but part of the land, its breath, its memory. By the late 1800s, the site where you had lived was reduced to little more than a green hump in a field and a ruined foundation discovered by accident during a survey for a new train line. The workers noted strange stones and dismissed them, digging around the tree rather than through it, for even then some still feared the roots might curse the track, and so they curved the rail just slightly, leaving your resting place untouched by steel or soot. And in the years that followed, children would dare one another to climb the twisted limbs of the tree, teenagers would sneak out to kiss beneath its shadow, poets would write about it, trying to capture the sadness of a place that could not explain why it felt so ancient and aware, and though no plaque marked your grave, no church claimed your soul, the land itself remembered you in silence. There is power in places unspoken for, power in lives that pass through history like ghosts with warm hands, shaping without conquering, healing without ceremony. Even in the 21st century, long after your story should have vanished, people still came, some by accident, hiking through the countryside and drawn by the tree's shape against the sky, some on purpose, guided by internet rumors and whispered mentions in old books. A few brought candles, others left coins or photographs, and a handful brought more, a lock of hair, a sealed letter, a vial of tears, things meant not for you but for the idea of you, the one who had come from somewhere else, who had survived an impossible life and lived with gentleness in an unforgiving world. They did not need to know your name, they only needed to believe that someone like you had once stood there, and in that belief they found a kind of sanctuary, a moment's pause in the rush of their modern lives. You had become, not by ambition but by accident, a symbol of endurance, of adaptation, of human dignity in the face of chaos. And so the story loops like seasons folding into themselves, like bells that ring long after the hand has left the rope. Somewhere even now, someone is dreaming that dream again, of waking to the sound of goats bleating and morning prayers echoing through the mist, of stepping out into a world made of dirt and smoke and raw, honest effort, and wondering how they will survive, and whether they will ever return to their own time, and they will walk where you once walked. Eat what you once ate, weep as you once wept, and perhaps in doing so they will find you, not in body but in the worn corners of the world, in the places where memory breathes. The medieval world you once stumbled into may be long gone, its plagues and kings and torments recorded only in brittle books and half-buried bones, but the soul of it remains, and you, by the accident of your arrival, the tenacity of your kindness, and the quiet courage of your days, became a part of that soul. You woke once in a century, not your own, and gave it something it did not ask for, but sorely needed, a witness, a helper, a stranger who did not run. And in every tale that flickers to life around a fire or beneath a tree, in every child who dreams of another time and wakes with the scent of straw in their hair, you are there still, part of the long, slow, beautiful hum of history, not forgotten, not erased, just endlessly remembered in the ways that matter most. And so it was that even in the faintest ripples of forgotten folklore and whispered superstitions, your presence endured, not as a ghost chained to misery or bound to some violent end, but as a quiet current beneath the river of time, shaping the silt and reeds of centuries with a grace no chronicler could quantify. The children who dared each other to touch the old oak's base sometimes dreamed of unfamiliar faces smiling softly at them, and old women in the village swore that the air around that tree grew warmer on days of sorrow, as if someone unseen placed a protective hand upon the grieving shoulder of the world. You had never sought to become a myth or a memory. Your time in that medieval world had been one of scrabbling for survival, of aching joints, cold mornings, aching feet wrapped in rags, but also of eyes wide with learning, of fingers stained with crushed herbs and parchment soot, of days spent listening to stories by firelight, as if each tale might tether you more tightly to the strange century you now called home. That firelight had reflected in the faces of people long turned to dust, Marga there, who taught you to bind wounds and bake barley loaves, Piers, who spoke little, but whose laughter came like sudden thunder when the children played in the mud, young Johann, always trailing behind you, curious about your city words and the strange symbols you sometimes traced in the dirt when you thought no one watched. They had not known you came from a time where carriages had engines and books glowed with light, but they had known your kindness, your hunger for understanding, your awe before the old ways they took for granted. And in knowing that, they had offered you something most strangers in that era never received a place, fragile though it was among them. You remembered still the sound of bells, those great iron throats tolling across the valley, calling the faithful, warning of fire, mourning the dead. You remembered the taste of unfiltered cider so tart, it made your jaw clench, the sharp cold of winter mornings when your breath frosted your eyelashes, and even the chickens huddled silently in their coop. You remembered fear, that constant companion not just of being found out, of being accused of witchery or madness, but the more mundane terror of fevers without medicine, childbirth without aid, wounds without stitches. There had been moments when the pain, the confusion, the aching loneliness of being unmoored in time felt like it would split your skull open with despair. But you had endured, and somehow that endurance had not soured into bitterness, but blossomed into empathy, like a late flower blooming in frost. You had learned, painfully and slowly, to knead the bread, to scrape the skins, to stitch the seams, to read the sky for storms, and the faces of others for signs of grief or hunger. You had become someone the village leaned on, though they never quite understood you. They said you'd been sent, or cursed, or that your mind had been touched by the spirits of the woods, and that you walked between worlds. You let them believe what gave them comfort. You had long given up on finding a way back, and yet something of your old self remained, curled like a seed within your chest, never fully dead. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind outside howled like wolves and the hearth's glow flickered low, you would hold a small smooth stone in your palm, just a pebble, but one you'd carried with you from that first strange day, and remember the harsh angles of street lights, the cold artificial hum of an electric world, the voices of loved ones now forever distant. You could no longer picture their faces clearly, not after so many years, but their memory pulsed faintly inside you like the warmth of old coals. It wasn't that you forgot, it was that remembering had become too painful, like pressing on an old scar, and so you poured yourself instead into the people of your new life, into tending the sick when no one else dared, into standing between a boy and his master's switch, into bartering with a travelling monk for salves and inks to copy healing texts, into saving seeds from spoiled harvests and planting them anew with quiet hope. You did not think of these things as extraordinary, they were simply what needed doing. But others began to tell stories of how your poultices cured festering wounds, of how you predicted the great freeze before it came, of how your prayers, though odd, seemed to bring calm. You never claimed magic. But in a world starved for hope, your steadiness felt like a miracle. When plague returned, and it always returned, you were among the first to walk into infected homes, armed with vinegar, herbs and fierce determination. You buried more than you saved. You wept when no one saw. But still you went, and your presence became something people whispered about with reverence. No one knew where you had come from, only that you had not been born in their valley, and yet you stayed when so many fled. Even as suspicion circled you, even as one harsh winter brought accusations of witchcraft, for how else did you know so much? You faced them not with fire, but with words. Calm, firm, heartbreaking truths about love, about loss, about the simple desire to make meaning in a world without fairness. And it was Margatha who stood beside you then, her old bones trembling with rage, declaring to all that you had nursed her son back from death when no priest dared enter her cottage. It was Piers who, though half-blind and nearly broken, lifted his voice to call you kin. And it was Johann, now a lanky youth with calloused hands, who shielded you with his own body when the crowd surged too close. In that moment, you knew something unshakable. You belonged not because you had mastered their ways, but because you had chosen them again and again, when it would have been easier to run. The years passed. You grew older, and though your mind remained sharp, your joints stiffened, your hair greyed, your back bent beneath the long weight of work and time. Children who had once hidden behind their mothers now brought their own babes to you, asking for remedies, for blessings, for stories of the old days. You never told them everything. How could you explain the world you had come from without sounding mad? But in small ways, you taught them. Hygiene rituals disguised as charms, simple machines explained as tricks, words from your native tongue softened into lullabies. And so your knowledge filtered into their world like light through stained glass, coloured, distorted, yet beautiful. When at last your breath grew shallow and your bones ached without end, you did not fear death. You had faced too many endings already. Your final days were quiet, spent beneath that same oak where you'd once sat bewildered and trembling, now gnarled and weathered like yourself. People came to say goodbye, not with grandeur, but with small acts, placing honey in your hand, washing your feet, reciting your favourite rhyme. And when you passed, it was not with fear, but with a sigh, soft as falling leaves. Your grave was simple, No cross, no stone, just a mound, and the oak's roots growing deeper, seeking the memory of you. They said flowers bloomed there, even in frost, that birds nested in its branches year-round, that once a sick child touched the bark and woke fever-free. The stories multiplied, grew strange. Some claimed they saw your ghost gathering herbs in the morning mist, others that you whispered answers in dreams. But whether true or not, these stories endured because they were needed, and what is history if not the story we need most? You had once feared you'd die forgotten in a world not your own. Instead, you had lived fully, painfully, lovingly, and been remembered, not for your origin, but for your heart. The centuries turned, empires fell, languages shifted, science exploded, machines rose. The world you came from blurred into the world that was. But deep in one valley, beside one ancient tree, a story persisted, not written in books, but passed in song, in soot, in soil. A story of someone who came from nowhere, and gave everything, and stayed. A story of what happens when a soul, lost in time, finds purpose in humanity. And that story, strange, soft, stubborn, carried forward the echo of your name, long after the clock you once knew had run out.